Jacob sat by the Jabbok River, his heart heavy with fear and guilt. The water reflected the flickering light of the moon, its gentle ripples mocking the turmoil within him. He had spent years running from his past, yet it seemed to always catch up. Tonight, he awaited a confrontation with his estranged brother, Esau, a man he had wronged deeply. Esau approached with 400 men, and Jacob's anxiety clouded him. Years ago, Jacob had tricked Esau out of his birthright and blessing, acts of cunning that had brought him wealth but no peace. Now, the weight of those decisions bore down upon him as he wrestled with his thoughts and fears. Alone by the river, Jacob prepared for the most pivotal night of his life. Jacob's journey to this moment had been fraught with struggles. Even before his birth, God revealed to his mother, Rebekah, that her twin sons would contend with one another. "Two nations are in your womb," God had said, "and the older shall serve the younger." From the moment of birth, Jacob's destiny seemed intertwined with conflicts as he emerged clutching Esau's heel. Growing up, Jacob was a quiet, calculating man who stayed near the tents, while Esau was a rugged hunter. This contrast shaped their father Isaac's favoritism toward Esau and their mother Rebekah's toward Jacob, sowing seeds of rivalry that would define their lives. Enjoying the story? Like, subscribe, and share to support us. Let's continue. The rivalry between the brothers reached its peak when Esau, famished from hunting, sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew. It was a calculated move by Jacob, whose cunning often masked his insecurities. Years later, Rebekah conspired with Jacob to deceive Isaac and secure the blessing meant for Esau. Jacob donned goat skins to mimic Esau's hairy arms, tricking his blind father into blessing him as the heir. When Esau discovered the betrayal, he vowed to kill Jacob, forcing him to flee to his uncle Laban's household in Haran. Jacob's actions were resourceful, but left a trail of broken relationships behind him. As Jacob fled from Esau, he had his first profound encounter with God. Exhausted and alone, he rested in the wilderness with a stone for a pillow. That night, he dreamed of a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending it. At the top stood the Lord, who promised Jacob that his descendants would inherit the land and be a blessing to all nations. Awaking from the dream, Jacob was filled with awe. He set up the stone as a pillar and named the place Bethel, vowing to serve God if he would protect him. This moment planted the seeds of Jacob's faith, though his journey of transformation was far from complete. Jacob arrived at his uncle Laban's home and quickly fell in love with Rachel, Laban's younger daughter. Her beauty captivated him, and he agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in exchange for her hand in marriage. Yet, on the wedding night, Laban deceived Jacob, substituting Leah, his elder daughter, for Rachel. When Jacob discovered the trick, he was outraged, but Laban insisted it was their custom to marry off the older daughter first. Jacob agreed to work another 7 years to marry Rachel, enduring this hardship out of love for her. This period of service revealed Jacob's perseverance, a quality that would define his later struggles. Jacob's household grew over the years. He fathered children with Leah, Rachel, and their maidservants, forming the foundation of what would become the 12 tribes of Israel. However, his relationship with Laban grew strained. Disputes over livestock and wealth led to mounting tension. God intervened, instructing Jacob to return to his homeland. Though Jacob obeyed, his heart was heavy with fear of meeting Esau again. His obedience marked a turning point in his journey, as he began to rely more on God's guidance than his own cunning. As Jacob prepared to leave Laban's household, he faced another trial. Laban accused Jacob of stealing idols from his household, unaware that Rachel had taken them. A tense confrontation ensued, but it was ultimately resolved without violence. This incident highlighted Jacob's growing reliance on God's protection rather than his schemes. Jacob erected a pillar to mark the covenant between him and Laban, symbolizing their truce. With his family and possessions in tow, Jacob set out toward his homeland, trusting in God's promises, but wary of the challenges ahead. On the way back to Canaan, Jacob's messengers returned with alarming news. Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men. Jacob was terrified, believing his brother still sought revenge. Desperate, he divided his people into two groups to minimize potential losses and send gifts ahead to appease Esau. That night, Jacob stayed behind, alone by the Jabbok River, to pray. His prayers were raw and desperate, reflecting his fear and longing for reconciliation. This was a moment of profound vulnerability, as Jacob wrestled not only with his past, but also with his reliance on God. As Jacob stood by the riverbank, consumed by his prayers, he suddenly felt the presence of another. A man emerged from the shadows and confronted him without a word. Before Jacob could react, the man lunged at him, and the two began to wrestle. This was no ordinary struggle. It was fierce, exhausting, and unlike anything Jacob had experienced before. Though Jacob was physically strong, his opponent seemed otherworldly, matching his every move. Hours passed, and neither man gained the upper hand. Jacob sensed that this being was divine, and his determination grew. He clung to the figure with a relentless grip, refusing to let go despite the strain on his body. The struggle continued until daybreak. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the man reached out and touched Jacob's hip, dislocating it instantly. Pain shot through Jacob's body, but he did not release his grip. "Let me go, for it is daybreak," the man said. But Jacob, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This moment marked a turning point for Jacob. He had spent his life manipulating and striving to achieve his goals, but now he was entirely dependent on this divine being's mercy. The man asked, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he replied. The man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob, now trembling with awe, realized that he had encountered God himself. The man blessed him, and as he departed, Jacob named the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Limping from his injury, Jacob rose with a new sense of purpose. Though his body was weakened, his spirit was transformed. Jacob's encounter with God gave him courage to face Esau. As the sun rose, he saw Esau approaching with his 400 men. Jacob arranged his family in groups, sending the servants and their children ahead, followed by Leah and her children, and lastly Rachel and Joseph. Jacob himself walked ahead of them all, bowing to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. His heart pounded, but he was prepared to face whatever outcome awaited him, trusting in God's protection and his newfound identity as Israel. To Jacob's astonishment, Esau ran to meet him, embracing him warmly and weeping. The two brothers, once bitter rivals, were reconciled in that moment. Esau inquired about Jacob's family and the gifts he had sent ahead. Jacob insisted that Esau accept the gifts, saying, "To see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably." Though Esau tried to persuade Jacob to travel together, Jacob chose to go his own way, ensuring the safety of his family while maintaining peace with his brother. Jacob continued his journey and settled near Shechem, where he purchased land and built an altar, naming it El Elohi Israel, meaning God, the God of Israel. Despite his growing faith, Jacob's family faced challenges. His daughter Dinah was defiled by Shechem, the son of a local ruler, leading to a violent retaliation by her brothers, Simeon and Levi. This act of vengeance caused turmoil within the family and strained their relations with the surrounding peoples. Jacob rebuked his sons, but knew that the family's actions carried far-reaching consequences. God called Jacob to return to Bethel, the place where he had first appeared to him. Jacob obeyed, ordering his household to rid themselves of foreign gods and purify themselves. At Bethel, Jacob built another altar, reaffirming his commitment to God. There, God appeared to him again, blessing him and reiterating the promise that his descendants would inherit the land. Jacob's faith deepened as he reflected on God's unwavering faithfulness despite his own flaws and failures. As they journeyed from Bethel, tragedy struck. Rachel went into labor and gave birth to Benjamin. but she died in childbirth. Jacob was devastated by her loss, mourning deeply as he buried her on the way to Ephrath, Bethlehem. He set up a pillar over her grave as a lasting memorial. Rachel's death marked a turning point for Jacob, reminding him of the fragility of life even amidst God's promises. Jacob's grief over Rachel was compounded by troubles among his children. His sons resented Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, because Jacob favored him openly. Their jealousy culminated in a cruel act. They sold Joseph into slavery and deceived Jacob into believing he had been killed by a wild animal. Jacob was inconsolable, tearing his clothes and mourning for days. Yet, even in his sorrow, God's hand was at work, setting the stage for future redemption. Years passed, and Jacob's household grew, but he remained haunted by the loss of Joseph. Then, during a severe famine, Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy grain. Unbeknownst to them, Joseph had risen to power in Egypt and was in charge of the grain supply. After testing his brothers' hearts, Joseph revealed his identity, and the family was reunited. When Jacob learned that Joseph was alive, he wept for joy and prepared to journey to Egypt to see his beloved son. Jacob's arrival in Egypt marked the beginning of a new chapter for his family. Pharaoh welcomed Jacob warmly, granting his family the fertile land of Goshen to settle in. Jacob blessed Pharaoh, a symbolic act of faith and gratitude. As the famine continued, God's provision through Joseph sustained Jacob's family and ensured their survival. Jacob marveled at how God had turned years of pain and separation into a testimony of his faithfulness. Before his death, Jacob gathered his sons to bless them and prophesy their futures. Each blessing carried both promises and warnings, reflecting their individual characters and destinies. To Joseph, Jacob gave a double portion of inheritance, blessing his sons Ephraim and Manasseh as his own. Jacob's words shaped the future of the 12 tribes of Israel, ensuring that God's covenant would continue through them. Jacob passed away peacefully in Egypt, surrounded by his family. Before his death, he made Joseph swear to bury him in Canaan, in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Isaac were buried. The family honored his request, carrying his body back to the promised land. Jacob's burial was a solemn and sacred event, symbolizing the enduring connection between his family and the land God had promised them. Though Jacob's life was filled with trials and sorrows, his faith in God's promises never wavered. His story became a cornerstone of Israel's identity, teaching future generations the value of perseverance, humility, and trust in God. Jacob's transformation from a cunning deceiver to a man of faith and humility reflects the power of God's grace to redeem and reshape lives. After Jacob's burial in Canaan, his sons returned to Egypt, but tension lingered among the brothers. They feared that with Jacob gone, Joseph might seek revenge for their past betrayal. They approached Joseph, pleading for forgiveness in the name of their late father. Joseph, moved by their words and their visible remorse, reassured them. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph's forgiveness not only mended their relationship, but also affirmed God's sovereign plan, working through their family's trials. Joseph's words resonated deeply with his brothers, who had spent years haunted by their guilt. His assurance of forgiveness brought healing to the family, reinforcing the belief that God's hand was present in every twist of their story. As the years passed, Jacob's descendants thrived in Egypt, their numbers growing steadily. Despite their comfort, Joseph often reminded them of God's promise to bring them back to the land of their ancestors, ensuring that their identity as God's chosen people remained at the forefront of their hearts. As Joseph neared the end of his life, he gathered his family to share a final vision of God's plan. He reaffirmed God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, reminding them that Egypt was not their final home. Joseph expressed his faith that God would deliver them and bring them back to the promised land. Before his death, Joseph requested that his bones be carried to Canaan when the time came, signifying the enduring connection to the land promised by God. Over generations, Jacob's descendants grew into the nation of Israel. The blessings Jacob had spoken over his sons shaped the tribes they formed. Reuben's tribe carried the legacy of strength, while Judah's line bore the promise of kingship and ultimately the Messiah. Joseph's descendants inherited blessings of abundance and leadership, while Levi's tribe was set apart for priesthood. Each blessing and prophecy found its fulfillment in time, proving the wisdom and foresight of Jacob's final words. The story of Jacob became a cornerstone of Israel's identity. His life, marked by struggle and redemption, reflected the journey of the nation itself. Like Jacob wrestling with God, Israel would face trials, exile, and eventual restoration. His transformation from a deceiver to a patriarch of faith served as a model for all who sought to walk in obedience and trust in God. His limp, a constant reminder of his divine encounter, became a symbol of humility and dependence on God's strength. Jacob's story offers timeless lessons about human nature and divine grace. His cunning, ambition, and flaws are juxtaposed with moments of faith, surrender, and perseverance. Through him, we see that God does not call the perfect, but rather transforms the willing. Jacob's wrestling match with God epitomizes the struggle of faith, acknowledging our weakness, yielding to God's will, and emerging stronger for it. His name change to Israel symbolizes the possibility of transformation for all who trust in God. The story of Jacob also underscores the importance of reconciliation and forgiveness. His reunion with Esau reveals how God can soften hearts and heal relationships, even those broken by years of betrayal. Likewise, Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers reflects the ultimate act of grace, mirroring God's own forgiveness of humanity. These moments remind us that reconciliation is a central theme of God's work in human lives, offering hope to those burdened by guilt or estrangement. Jacob's legacy is ultimately one of faith in God's promises. Through every struggle and triumph, he held on to the covenant passed down from Abraham and Isaac, trusting that God's plan would prevail. His life serves as a reminder that faith often requires wrestling with doubts, enduring hardships, and surrendering control to God. Yet, through it all, Jacob's story shows us that God's grace is sufficient, his promises are sure, and his blessings await those who persevere. Jacob, the man who wrestled with God and was transformed, leaves us with a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us today.